Any prison guard will tell you that despite some prisoners being dumb enough to get arrested and get caught, some of them can be geniuses given enough time inside the prison walls. They can figure out ways to make shanks and weapons out of literally anything. They can come up with insane ways of smuggling items into the prison and very many other intelligent things that make them very resourceful. But sometimes you get a prisoner who is really smart. Someone who can come up with plans that no one else could come up with, can craft items that no one else can craft, and also create windows of opportunity that no one else could create. A prisoner like this could end up becoming a very big problem for the prison guards. And he was. Mark Defriest. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get into the mad lad, it's your boy, Raid Shadow Legends. With millions of champion combinations and countless tactics to master, there is no end to the different ways you can fight raid bosses, do dungeon runs, battle in the campaign, or compete in the PvP arena. The newest boss just released in Raid is the biggest and craziest yet. It is a Hydra with multiple different heads, making it even more challenging because each head is its own boss fight. The head of Blight is all about poison. It poisons you and protects itself with a poison cloud, which makes it very hard to hit. The head of Torment constantly applies true fear to your guys, and the only way to stop this is by hiding your champions with veil bluffs. The head of Mischief just straight up steals your bluffs. The head of Wrath is the damage dealer, and if you hit it 15 times, it gets a new buff called Vengeance, which triples its attack power, which is a wipe. The head of Decay can put out a life barrier on other heads, and if you can't break it fast enough, they will be fully healed. And there is also the head of Suffering, and it's the Hydra's main tank head. And my favourite thing to do in Raid is collecting tiers in the PvP arena, and the fastest way to get your champion ready for the arena is to farm the campaign. You grind XP, loads of silver, and a few artifacts at the same time. If the biggest boss in the history of mobile games isn't enough for you, Raid are also giving away a super limited edition champion to every player in the game. Between now and January the 28th, 2022, you can claim esports legend Simple's limited edition champion, available for free to both new and old players in Raid. All you have to do is log in for 7 days between now and January 28th. This month, Raid is releasing a bunch of awesome new champions along with a brand new Faction Wars crypt, and I can't wait for the crypt to open up so that I can dive in and see what it's all about. And on top of that, there is a ton of New Year events and tournaments, including a special fusion event where you can get one of Raid's newest legendary champions. So if you use my link in the description or scan my QR code on the screen, you will get a free starter pack worth almost $30 to kickstart your game. You will get a free champion called Vergis, who is actually pretty baller. You will also get 200,000 silver, an energy refill, an XP booster, and an ancient shard, so you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get into the game. These rewards are only available to new players and only for the next 30 days, and you can find these rewards here in your inbox. Mark Corwin Defriest was born on the 18th of August 1960 in Gadsden County in Florida, and he grew up with his father and stepmother. Mark's early years were very promising since his dad noticed that he was very interested in how things worked, their internal mechanisms and the parts that made them up and so on. So his father encouraged Mark to learn as much as he could. During the day, Mark worked with his dad, and he had been allowed to have a small lab in the basement of their home that he called the Radio Shack. Mark thought of it like his own little Frankenstein's lab, and there he would take anything and everything apart and conduct some elaborate scientific experiments, and he became very masterful at breaking down clocks, watches, and other items down into their component parts and then putting them back together again in full working order. And also on a couple of occasions, he almost blew himself up. From a young age, many people believed Mark to be a savant. However, Mark couldn't really understand people, and he was absolutely useless in social situations. And because of this and his intelligence, it's been theorised that Mark has Asperger's syndrome. But during his childhood, society at that time didn't actually know what Asperger's was. So his parents had no idea how to handle it. Mark was very close to his dad, and while he was at home, his dad would teach him some of his military training skills from his time in the Office of Strategic Services, which was the intelligence agency of the United States during World War II, and it was a predecessor to the CIA. Mark started his training at just 6 years old, which involved subjects such as guerrilla warfare, infiltration, counterintelligence, and he was even taught about explosives. Despite all of this stuff just being a dad having some innocent fun with his son and impressing him with all of this cool spy stuff, the knowledge that Mark gained from this would become extremely useful to him later in his life. When Mark was older, despite highly respecting his dad, he said that his father was pretty nuts because of the war culture and because he was brainwashed by a lot of the, and I quote, "Reds are coming" propaganda. Outside of his dad's training, Mark would eventually have to go to school, and after only a short time there, he didn't get along with the other students and he caused a lot of trouble. Mark didn't want to spend any time with the other kids and would very often sit alone. Because of his behaviour, Mark's parents pulled him out of school and sent him to a local boys' disciplinary school to try and knock him into shape. Mark hated this school so much that he broke out and escaped. This is going to be a running theme for a lot of Mark's story. As Mark got older, he and his dad worked on some large projects in the community, and while doing welding repairs on a local bridge in Chattahoochee, Mark visited a nearby restaurant with his dad, and he met a girl there called Brenda, who was working there as a waitress at the time. Brenda says that she was instantly attracted to Mark's blue eyes, blonde hair, and his intelligence, and after some time dating, they got married. Brenda said that Mark's truck became his pride and joy, and in the back of his truck was every tool a mechanic could need. They would go on road trips together and live off the money that Mark made by fixing broken down vehicles at the side of the road that they found while on their travels. Brenda said that Mark could fix absolutely anything that you put him to work on. Though Mark was very close with his dad and he loved him very much, he felt the complete opposite way about his stepmother. She and Mark did not like each other at all. She would treat him like shit, screaming at him for the smallest things, and was overall very neglectful of him. Mark's wife Brenda said that she was a cold bitch and never gave Mark any nurturing or affection. And the truth is, she most likely saw Mark as baggage and wished he wasn't there. As the years went on, Mark's intelligence grew, along with his social issues. And in 1979, at the age of 19, he found out the worst news of his life, later than he should have, since no one told him. His father, his only real friend, had died, leaving him with no one but his cold, uncaring stepmother. Mark wasn't left with nothing, however, because his dad had promised him that he could have his tools. These tools meant the world to Mark, as he and his dad had used them together while they were working on projects, which were some of the happiest moments in Mark's life. Obviously, they were still very useful to Mark, as he still had a great interest in knowing how things worked, fixing things and building his own contraptions, but the tools still held enormous sentimental value. To Mark, it made logical sense that these tools were now his property, since his dad had passed away and promised to give them to him. So Mark took them. Mark, however, while extremely intelligent, wasn't too clued up on how the law worked when it came to wills. In his father's will, he did leave the tools to Mark, but the will had not been probated yet, meaning that the tools were not officially his until they had gone through the proper legal process. And Mark's stepmother, being the spiteful bitch that she is, reported Mark to the police for theft. The police approached Mark's trailer and they just wanted to have a talk with him about the situation because it was just a simple family disagreement. But Mark, confused as to why the police were after him, ran out of the back of his trailer and tried to escape on foot. Which, yeah, when you haven't exactly done anything wrong, it's not really a smart thing to do. Mark fled to Alabama, where he was found by the police and extradited back to Florida, where he was charged with the theft of the tools, being in possession of a weapon, and also evading arrest. Even though these were very minor offences, and let's be real, the tools were rightfully his, Mark was given a 4-year sentence. Or at least it should have been 4 years. Being in prison was hell for Mark, so he didn't want to stick around. Mark had only been in Bay County Jail for a month before his first escape attempt, when, returning from Bible study class, a group of 8 inmates started to run. Their plan was to climb the fence and escape. Now, Mark was not in this plan. He had absolutely no idea. This was just something that these 8 guys had planned on their own, but when Mark saw them running for the fence, he thought to himself, fuck it, might as well join in. The problem was that at the top of the fence, as you would expect, was razor wire. Now, none of the other inmates knew how to get over this obstacle, but thanks to the OSS training that Mark had received from his father as a child, Mark knew exactly how to get over the razor wire, and he climbed over it without any issue. And after getting over the fence, the other inmates were begging Mark for help because even though he wasn't even in on the plan, he was the only one who got over the fence. Mark then hotwired a car and escaped, later checking himself into the Driftwood Motel for the night. The escape went perfectly, but like we've said before, Mark was extremely intelligent but not very socially aware. So he didn't know to keep a low profile. So he was quickly caught and returned to jail. On top of that, Mark now had 6 new charges that he pled guilty to, so that resulted in an even longer sentence. But it was also recommended that, due to his behaviour, he should undergo a psychiatric evaluation. Jail was a hell of a lot tougher for Mark because he was a loner. He wasn't in a gang and he didn't want to be. So he had zero means of protection. So one day, 15 inmates decided to take advantage of this and... Have you ever seen American History X? Yeah, that. The attack was so bad for Mark that he needed surgery afterwards. Of course, this event traumatised Mark, and his behaviour in jail got even worse. He attempted suicide, and he repeatedly hit his head against the door and walls of his cell. His psychiatric assessment couldn't come soon enough. After Mark's first sentencing, his wife Brenda said that she would wait for him for the 4 years that he was originally sentenced to. But Mark didn't help the situation because he kept receiving disciplinary reports for not following the rules and committing further crimes while in prison, which would just extend his sentence each time. Brenda eventually got tired of waiting for Mark, asking him, "How long do you expect me to wait for you?" She also said that she didn't want to be one of those wives. You know, the one whose man is permanently in prison. She felt like it linked her to the criminals in some way. Brenda also said that the guards would try and bribe her for sexual favours in order to make things a little easier for Mark. All of these issues eventually led to her wanting a divorce. Finally, Mark was transferred to Florida State Hospital in Chattahoochee, Gadsden County, to undergo his psychological evaluation. But Mark hated this place just as much as prison, and he wanted to get out. He didn't like being around the crazies, as he called them, and he saw himself as different to them. Fortunately, mental hospitals are a lot easier to escape from than a maximum security prison. So Mark concocted a plan. A plan that turned out to be fucking hilarious. Back in these days, LSD was sometimes used in experimental treatment to see if it could somehow magically cure mental illness. And Mark managed to steal a large bottle of LSD from the hospital's pharmacy. He had also taken a mental note of the staff shift changes and the room where they would all go to get their coffee. Can you see where this is going? Just before the shift change, Mark mixed the LSD into a pot of freshly made coffee. And when it comes to LSD, a little will do the job. But Mark dumped in the entire fucking bottle, which was the equivalent to about 100 tabs of acid. So yeah, these people were about to get sent into fucking space. The idea was that the staff would drink the coffee, start tripping and freaking out, and while everyone was nice and distracted, Mark could casually take his time unlocking all of the doors and leaving the building. The problem was, someone had alerted the security team because the staff were, as expected, freaking out. But since Mark used the whole fucking bottle, they were really freaking out. A member of staff started tripping in the laundry room, and they were staring into one of the washing machines as it was spinning. You know, standard acid stuff. But something happened. We aren't sure what happened. Maybe the elves inside the washing machine insulted the member of staff's mother. Who knows? What we do know is that the member of staff went fucking ballistic and started fighting the washing machine. They were screaming while punching and kicking it, and they even managed to rip the door off it. Eventually, they had to be restrained and pulled away. While all of this was happening, a female psychologist was walking through the centre aisle of the ward, making sexually suggestive comments to the inmates and putting her hands between her legs while shouting, "My pussy is hot." By the time Mark could make his move, security had surrounded the chaotic ward to get everything back under control. So Mark's escape attempt was unsuccessful, but it was downright hilarious. 6 different psychologists had evaluated Mark, and 5 of them found him to be legally incompetent to stand trial. Except for one. Dr. Robert Berland. His assessment found Mark to be completely sane due to the amount of skill and planning required for his escapes and the fact that he could hold a conversation for a normal amount of time. 5 jailers were also interviewed about Mark's behaviour in prison, and 4 of them said that his behaviour was completely normal. But according to a newly hired jailer, Mark would lose contact with his surroundings. He would also eat bugs, and he would repeatedly stomp around his cell for hours. But despite all this, Berland believed that Mark was faking mental illness and was completely sane. So, ignoring all of the other evaluations and only using Berland's, Mark was removed from the mental hospital and sent back to prison. During his time in prison, Mark met a woman called Bonnie through a pen pal list, and after writing to each other for some time, they eventually decided to get married. The marriage was via proxy, and they hadn't even met each other until a week after the wedding. Over the years, Mark would send Bonnie cards and artwork that he had made in jail, and one of them was a depiction of how he was feeling. Turns out that meme has been around for a lot longer than we thought. Mark was asked if he wanted to join a prison woodworking class, and he quickly accepted. After all, this was the exact type of thing that he loved. However, putting someone with MacGyver-level skills in such an environment would probably spell trouble. And it did, in a pretty extreme way. Mark found some rolled up copper sheets and other useful components, and he managed to build himself not 1, but 2 double-barrel zip guns. After building them, he hid them in the back and front of his underwear, and when he was returned back to his cell, he dug one of his back teeth out with an ice pick. His mouth started pissing blood, so now he could be taken to the nurse's station. And the leg irons that he was wearing hid the guns as he was escorted through the metal detectors. After checking Mark's teeth, the emergency dentist identified it as self-mutilation and patched him up. But before he was returned to his cell, Mark said that he needed to use the bathroom. And the idiot guard allowed him to go into the bathroom without supervision while he stood outside on the other side of the door. Mark then picked his cuffs and burst out of the bathroom, pointing his improvised guns in the faces of the waiting guards. And he said to them, "If you move, I'll blow your fucking brains out." Some of the other prisoners in the medical ward started laughing their heads off, and some of the guards weren't quite convinced about the severity of the situation, until Mark fired one of the zip guns at a phone on a desk, blowing it apart, proving to the guards that yes, these zip guns are in fact real, and yes, they do in fact work. Realising the seriousness of the situation, everyone stood down and let Mark make his escape. Mark got out of the prison and hoped that a car would be driving by so that he could hijack it. But no car came. So he went to his second plan of running into the swamp. As usual for Mark though, he was really good at the escaping part, but not so much at the staying escaped part. The police found him with a gun in a car that he had borrowed. Though some people believe that the gun was just a coincidence and just so happened to be in the car, since they knew that Mark would never actually shoot anyone and, Despite knowing how to make his own firearms, guns were never really his forte. They at first tried to send him back to the hospital, but the hospital didn't want him back. And after what he did to their coffee, I don't really blame them. So Mark was returned back to Bay County Jail. He was put into solitary confinement and forced to wear a straitjacket and leg irons. Mark, of course, reacted very badly to this and tried his best to escape the situation. He destroyed everything in his cell. In one instance, he got out of his straitjacket and leg irons in the space of 5 minutes, and he tore up his padded cell using a toothbrush. In one of the cells, he broke a light and he noticed some plumbing behind it. So he pulled out one of the pipes and used it to pry open his cell door. Mark started going through what he called a gunsmith phase, where he would make guns out of anything that he could get his hands on. One of them was even made using a toothpaste tube. As usual, he was his own worst enemy, and he ended up getting into a lot of trouble for firing one of them at a guard. Although Mark denied this and said that it was a test fire and he was aiming at something else. This got him an attempted murder charge, and he went right back to solitary confinement after the prison guard goon squad beat the fuck out of him. And the guards were going to make him pay for this. In solitary confinement, Mark lived in total darkness with no light, no clothes, and he wasn't allowed to speak or have contact with anyone. He was also not allowed anything in his cell, including basic things like toilet paper. And even if he had any, he couldn't use the toilet because the guards shut off the water to his cell. He had to eat all of his food with his bare hands, and it was basically like being in a medieval dungeon. The guards would even spray him with water hoses and mace every time he got comfortable enough to sleep. The prison guards were determined to break him. It was described as being like a North Vietnamese prisoner of war. When he was due to return to court, he was held down and shaved and washed with a thick bristle brush. The guards wanted him to plead guilty for trying to kill one of them. And Mark did, because in his words, he didn't really give a shit by that point, and he just wanted it to be over with. He had been beaten, tortured, and demoralised. Most prisons in the US at this time were pretty horrific. The amount of abuse and corruption happening was off the scale. But there was one prison that no criminal would ever want to be sent to. Even mentioning the name of this prison to the most hardened criminals would immediately demand compliance from them. And that prison was Florida State Prison, or simply FSP. This was a prison that inmates of other prisons were transferred to as punishment. It was ridiculously strict. The slightest infraction would lose you a week of yard time, an entire week of not seeing the sun. This is the prison that Mark was sent to. He had made the prison system look like fools, so they were going to punish him for it. After some time, Mark became, putting it bluntly, a prison bitch for a Cuban guy called Uno, who would refer to Mark as Mrs. Wendy Castro. Uno married Mark and had a bunch of rules for him. One of them was that Mark had to act like a woman at all times. Mark said that he wasn't gay or a transvestite and constantly complained about this. Now, after all, he was told to act like a woman, but he needed the protection, and everyone in the prison did leave him alone. It was purely for survival. The irony being that the guy protecting him was also the one abusing him. Despite all of the horrific shit that he was going through, Mark was still rebellious. The prison staff kept finding weapons, tools, and components in his cell. Homemade handcuff keys, saw blades hidden in the soles of shoes, shivs, and even 5 .22 caliber bullets hidden under his bed. I have no idea how the fuck he got a hold of those. When Mark was asked about the contraband, he would just say, "I'm James Bond 007. The guards also then had to start keeping their keys inside their pockets because Mark was able to copy them just by looking at them. Mark noticed that the prison food trays were all the exact thickness of the jail keys. So he would cut the keys out of the lunch trays. And after the guards had worked out what Mark was using to make the keys, they didn't allow him to have lunch trays. But that didn't matter to Mark because then he just started making the keys out of paper. And they still worked. He even built a small radio that he called the Sony Buttman. Guess where he kept it? After he had built his radio, Mark would do drugs that he had smuggled into his cell and listen to music. Later in his sentence, Mark made another double-barrel zip gun and began cutting through the prison bars of another inmate's cell, which took 8 hours per bar. After all the bars had been removed, Mark jumped down from quite a height into the women's exercise yard and escaped over the razor wire fence. Business as usual. It wasn't until the rush had died down and Mark was 2 miles down the street that he noticed that the fall from the window had broken both of his feet and his wrist. Adrenaline's a hell of a thing, but he still managed to hijack a big rig truck and ram it through a police roadblock. Of course, they weren't going to let him get away, so an old-school police chase started. Mark, however, wanted to keep the police on their toes, and he realised that if he was going forward, the chase wouldn't end until he was caught. So, instead, Mark decided to just reverse over the police cars in his huge truck. While the police panicked and started shooting at him from underneath, Mark managed to get the truck stuck in someone's living room after reversing into some poor bastard's house. Either way, Mark was fucked and again returned to jail, with yet even more time added to his sentence. And as usual, not only was prison life very rough for Mark, it was in fact an awful lot worse. He said that prisoners were dying all around him, either by the goon squad beating them or the electric chair. The goon squad were a group of guards who got their jollies by beating up prisoners. And Mark even had a cell neighbouring Ted Bundy's for a time, at least until Bundy got the chair. Deaths by the goon squad were most likely being covered up. The warden, Ron McAndrew, saw inmates on the floor with their eyes swollen shut. He later said that it wasn't a question of if they would kill someone, but when. And he was absolutely right, because in 1999, the goon squad killed an inmate called Frank Valdez. Now, Mark had actually witnessed the murder of Valdez, and he also confirmed the medical examiner's conclusion. Because of this, Mark was transferred to a prison in California for his protection, since no doubt the goon squad would be coming after him for revenge. There is a possibility that this might be the only murder that the goon squad committed that got any outside attention. Apparently, after the new prison warden started looking into the prison beatings, the warden was told that he was going to be moved to a prison in Orlando. Absolutely nothing suspicious there. While incarcerated at Florida State Prison, Mark totaled 209 disciplinary reports for creating weapons and tools, as well as his multiple attempts to escape. No other prisoner has this many reports, and over time, this increased his projected parole date. The warden at the time believed that many of the reports filed against Mark were false accusations by prison staff to get back at him out of spite. Mark has so far spent 27 years in solitary confinement, and a lot of that time has been without light. 30 extra years have been added to his sentence due to his escapes and escape attempts. So much time has been added to Mark's original 4-year sentence that he received in 1979 that he now will not be released from prison until 2085. That's 106 years. Mark was approached by a writer and director named Gabriel London to film a documentary about his story called The Life and Mind of Mark Defriest, which was released in 2014. The documentary helped rally people to Mark's cause and see how unfair his sentence has been. A lot of people have the opinion that Mark could have done great things with his extremely intelligent mind, and him being locked up was a waste not just to him, but to the greater community. Dr. Robert Berland returned many years later because he believed that his original diagnosis of Mark was wrong. It had been a very long time since the two had saw each other, and although I'm sure there was some bitterness between the two at first, after doing another mental evaluation, Berland believed that Mark definitely showed signs of mental abnormality, which was most likely made worse by the multiple head injuries that he had sustained during prison beatings by prisoners and guards, as well as 27 years in solitary confinement. Because would you believe that 27 years in solitary confinement, most of which were without light, kind of has a little bit of a negative mental effect on a man? Mark was finally granted parole on February the 5th, 2019, with one of the conditions being that he would spend 12 months in a mental health and substance abuse treatment facility in Corvallis, Oregon. The location was agreed upon due to the proximity to the home of his wife. However, only 4 days later, Mark had what was called a manic episode. So they tested his urine, and his urine test showed kidney failure and traces of methamphetamine. The next day, Mark was thrown out of the facility and again sent back to Florida. And the parole revocation process was started. Mark's legal team came together to help him again to put forth an appeal for leniency. They pleaded with both Florida and California to not throw him back in jail, but to instead provide the appropriate treatment and care for his condition, which now included a severe drug addiction that he developed while incarcerated. The appeal has been denied, and the state of Florida issued an arrest warrant and arranged for Mark to be transported back home, where he will continue to be incarcerated, most likely for the rest of his life. On February the 15th, 2019, Gabriel London and Bonnie Defriest dropped Mark off at the San Joaquin County Probation Office. He was photographed in the parking lot with Bonnie a few moments before turning himself in. Mark's wife Bonnie sadly died on the 23rd of August 2020 at the age of 90. The worst part is that she will never know if Mark will ever be free. But at least she stood by him to the very end. It just seems like such a waste that such a brilliant mind was locked away for so long over some complete bullshit. Just because he took tools, which, let's face it, they were rightfully his. He just reacted to the police arriving in a very bad way, which was doubly unfortunate because this happened at a time in history when cops and institutions and courts didn't know what Asperger's was and didn't understand it. It just seems like such a complete waste that the world has been robbed of what I believe to be such a brilliant mind. Mark is currently 61 and he remains incarcerated in Florida until his next parole hearing. And let's hope for his own sake that he keeps to the rules this time, but from what we know of Mark, he probably won't.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube! Everybody should subscribe!